The rain over London did not fall, it commanded. It turned the cobblestones of the Royal Opera House into a dark, reflective mirror, catching the flickering orange of gaslight and the cold, emerald shimmer of the woman standing at the carriage door. Duke Adrian Ravenshire was a man who had never known the weight of his own shadow, yet here he was, collapsed into the very mud he had once claimed she was made of. His hands, usually gloved in the finest kidskin, were bare and trembling, pressing into the wet grit of the street. He looked up, his face a contorted map of ugly cry desperation. "Rosalie, please," he choked out, the sound of her name a jagged glass shard in his throat. One word, a single nod in the ballroom tonight would stay the hand of every creditor in this city. "You are the Comtesse now. You have the power to save me." Lady Rosalie Beaumont did not look down. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon of the street, her posture as symmetrical and rigid as the marble pillars of the Parthenon. In her emerald velvet gown, she was a pillar of absolute vertical authority, a stark contrast to the messy, horizontal ruin of the man at her feet, to the 4 kings' guards standing behind her, a silent, bearskin-capped wall of judgment. The Duke was little more than an obstacle to be stepped over. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. This was the man who had once stood in the center of the 1819 ballroom and told the elite of London that Rosalie was a clinging vine with no roots, a girl who withered the moment she was ignored. Now the oak had rotted, and the vine had become the sovereign. "I am the Comtesse de Valois, your grace," she said, her voice like a cello, deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. She finally turned her head, but her eyes remained dead-eye stoic. She didn't see a former lover or a bitter enemy. She saw a beggar who had overstayed his welcome on her path. Adrian reached out, his fingers hovering near the hem of her gown, a pathetic triangle of supplication. "I am a Duke of the realm," he cried, a final, hollow grasp at a status that had already evaporated. Rosalie finally moved. She didn't recoil in disgust, nor did she strike him. She simply stepped forward. Her emerald silk slipper found a dry patch of stone just inches from his pleading hand, and she walked past him with a clinical indifference that felt more violent than a blow. As she ascended the carriage steps, the guards closed ranks, their physical presence erasing the Duke from the light. In the mud of the London docks, Adrian Ravenshire realized the true cost of his past. He was no longer worth even her anger. The memory of the rain in the London docks dissolved, replaced by the suffocating heat of 1,000 beeswax candles. 6 years ago, the air in the Olmax ballroom had smelled not of damp earth, but of expensive lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of judgment. Rosalie stood at the edge of the dance floor, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped a fan that felt like a shield. She was 19, wearing a dress of pale, apologetic cream that seemed to wash her out against the vibrant silks of the season's favorites. Her heart, however, was a riot of color. She was looking at Adrian. He was the sun around which the Tun orbited, the Duke of Ravenshire, a man of such effortless, gravitational authority that a single smile from him could cement a debutante's future for a decade. They had whispered in the moonlit gardens of 3 different estates that month. He had held her hand behind the shelter of a marble statue and told her she was refreshing. When the violins began the first notes of a waltz, Rosalie stepped forward, her eyes bright with a hope that felt like a prayer. She waited for him to break away from his circle of laughing sycophants. She waited for the hand that had squeezed hers in the dark. Instead, Adrian didn't even turn his body toward her. He looked at her over his shoulder, his handsome features twisting into a look of bored derision that silenced the nearby conversations. "A dance, Lady Rosalie?" he asked, his voice carrying with the practiced projection of a stage actor. He didn't wait for her answer. He turned back to his friends, his laugh cutting through the room like a guillotine. "I think not. One must be careful with whom one associates. Some women are like clinging vines, pretty enough to look at perhaps, but they have no roots of their own. They simply wrap themselves around something stronger and hope to be pulled into the light." The circle erupted in tittering laughter. Rosalie felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold in the sweltering room. The social wall of judgment formed instantly. The women pulled their skirts away as she passed, and the men looked through her as if she had already become a ghost. "A vine with no roots," someone whispered behind a lace fan. In that moment, the girl who believed in moonlit promises died. She didn't cry, not there, under the gaze of 500 witnesses. She simply turned and walked toward the exit, each step a heavy, rhythmic pulse of agony. Adrian had not just refused a dance, he had stripped her of her humanity, labeling her a parasite in the only world she had ever known. As she reached the carriage, the humiliation settled into her bones, a cold, hard stone that would, over the next 6 years, be sharpened into a blade. She had been the vine, and he the oak. But oaks, she realized as the carriage wheels began to churn, were only strong until the winter came. The ship that carried Rosalie Beaumont away from the chalky cliffs of Dover was not a vessel of escape, but a crucible. As the London skyline faded into a grey smudge of hypocrisy, she shed the pale, apologetic cream of her debutante days. In Paris, and later in the gold-drenched salons of Vienna, the clinging vine began to grow thorns of cold, hard intellect. The transformation was not merely aesthetic, it was structural. She spent her mornings not over embroidery, but over the ledgers of the Bourse, mentored by an exiled uncle who saw in her hollowed-out eyes a terrifying capacity for calculation. While the ton in London gossiped about her ruin, Rosalie was learning the language of leverage. She realized that a duke's power was a fragile thing, built on the shifting sands of debt and inherited ego. By the 3rd year, she had discarded her name. Rosalie was a girl who bled. The Comtesse de Valois was a woman who bled others. She began to trade in the one currency more potent than bloodlines: information. She moved through the continent like a shadow, her emerald green gown becoming her signature, a high-saturation, color pop in a world of muted diplomatic grays. It was a hue that signaled life, yes, but also the poisonous envy of those who realized too late that she had surpassed them. She watched from afar as the Duke of Ravenshire's empire began to fray. Every time he lost £1,000 at the tables of Crockford, a silent order was issued from a desk in a Parisian townhouse to buy his notes. Every time his tenants revolted against his neglect, a faceless entity offered them better terms, slowly siphoning the loyalty of his land. The glow-up was complete when she stood before the mirror on the eve of her return. The reflection did not show a girl seeking light, it showed a woman who generated her own. Her diamonds were not gifts from a suitor, but spoils of war. Her posture was no longer a shield, but a pillar of vertical stability that made the world around her seem chaotic and small. She had become the financier of kings, a woman whose dead-eye stoicism could crash a market or elevate a pauper. As she boarded the vessel back to England, she clutched a small, leather-bound book containing the names of every man who had laughed behind a lace fan 6 years ago. Adrian Ravenshire was at the top of the list, underlined in the same emerald ink she used to sign his warrants of debt. The vine had not just survived, it had reconstructed the forest, and now it was time to see if the oak could withstand the storm she was bringing home. The mahogany desk in the Duke of Ravenshire's study, once a symbol of unyielding power, was now a graveyard of ivory-colored demands and scarlet-sealed foreclosures. Adrian sat in the dim light of a dying fire, his cravat loosened and his eyes bloodshot from a night of chasing his losses in a crystal glass of amber liquid. The oak of London was rotting from the inside out, hollowed by a decade of arrogance and a string of catastrophic wagers that had turned his ancestral wealth into a memory. Every shadow in the room seemed to mock him, whispering the very words he had once used to bury a girl's reputation. No roots. It was a cruel irony that now defined his own existence. His title was a husk. His lands were mortgaged to a faceless continental syndicate. Even his friends at the clubs had begun to treat him with the same social invisibility he had once mastered. They didn't look at him, they looked through him, waiting for the inevitable moment the bailiffs arrived to strip the velvet from his walls. In the quiet hours, when the brandy failed to numb the edges of his mind, he was haunted by a single image, Rosalie Beaumont's face as she had stood in that 1819 ballroom. He remembered the precise moment the light had died in her eyes, extinguished by his own laughter. At the time, it had felt like a triumph, a demonstration of his absolute vertical authority over the clinging vines of the world. Now, as he stared at a stack of unpaid bills, he realized he had been the one clinging to a status that required no effort to maintain, while she had been forced to grow in the dark. A letter sat atop the pile, written in a sharp, emerald ink that seemed to vibrate against the parchment. It was a formal notification that his largest debt had been purchased by the Comtesse de Valois. The name was new to London, a colour pop of intrigue in a stagnant season, but the cold precision of the takeover felt personal. Adrian leaned back, a raw agony etching lines into a face that had once been the toast of the ton. He was a duke with no soil left to claim, a man physically crumbling while the world watched with a sharp, collective schadenfreude. He needed a savior, a social or financial endorsement so powerful it could reset the scales. He began to draft a plea to this mysterious comtesse, his begging hands shaking as he dipped his pen. He didn't know that the girl he had stepped on was now the ground he was praying to walk upon. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was the one looking up from the mud, desperate for a scrap of the light he had so casually thrown away. The double doors of the Duchess of Somerset's ballroom swung open, and for the first time in 6 years, the orchestra faltered. It was not a grand announcement that silenced the room, but a shift in the very atmosphere, a sudden, high-saturation, color pop of emerald green cutting through a sea of predictable pastels. Rosalie Beaumont did not enter the room, she occupied it. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her face partially obscured by a mask of intricate gold filigree, though her dead-eye stoicism was unmistakable even through the metal. Her gown, a masterpiece of heavy Parisian velvet, shimmered with a depth that made every other woman's silk look thin and apologetic. She was no longer a girl seeking a glance. She was a sovereign waiting for the world to catch its breath. As she descended, the social proof of her power was instantaneous. Countless gentlemen, many who had once turned their backs on a disgraced wallflower, now angled their bodies toward her like sunflowers to a dark green sun. Ambition and lust created a palpable curiosity gap in the air. Who was this Comtesse de Valois, this financier who held the debts of ministries and the secrets of kings? They flocked to her feet, offering bows that were lower than any they had given the queen, desperate for a scrap of her attention. Rosalie accepted their homage with a cold, royal detachment. She moved through the crowd with a vertical stability that made the frantic social posturing around her seem chaotic. She danced with a marquis, then a prince, her movements fluid and precise, but her eyes never truly saw them. She was hunting. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows cast by a towering marble pillar, was the Duke of Ravenshire. He looked like a ghost at his own funeral. His coat was brushed but frayed at the cuffs, and his face was a mask of raw agony as he watched the woman who held his life in her hands. He didn't recognize her, not yet. To him, she was merely the Emerald Queen, the final lifeline in a sea of red ink. Rosalie felt his gaze like a cold draft. She turned her head just enough for the light to catch the edge of her mask, but she did not acknowledge him. She let him linger in the witness wall of the crowd, a man no longer worth the breath of a greeting. Every man in the room was at her feet, basking in her glow, but the only man she truly saw was the one she intended to leave in the dark. The hunt had begun, and the oak was finally realizing that the vine had grown tall enough to block out his sun. The air in the library of Ravenshire House was thick with the smell of old paper and the metallic tang of fear. Adrian sat hunched over a sprawl of legal documents, his hands trembling as he traced the signature at the bottom of his most recent foreclosure notice. It was written in that same unsettling emerald green ink, the Comtesse de Valois. For weeks he had been hunted by a shadow. His gambling debts at Crockford's, the mortgage on his hunting lodge, even the vowels he had scribbled in a drunken stupor, all of them had been systematically bought by this singular, mysterious woman. She hadn't just acquired his debt, she had cornered his life. He was a duke of the realm, yet he was currently living in a house that, on paper, belonged to a stranger who had appeared in London like a sudden, violent storm. The rising tension in his chest was a physical weight. Every knock at the door sounded like a bailiff's hammer. Every glance from his peers felt like a post-mortem. He looked at the invitation to the Somerset ball sitting on his desk. The Emerald Queen would be there. She was his ruin, but in the twisted logic of a desperate man, she was also his only hope. If she is a woman, Adrian whispered to the empty, shadowed room. She has a weakness. He stood and walked to the mirror, smoothing the lapels of his coat with a practiced, predatory grace. The raw agony of his financial decay was hidden beneath a mask of resurrected charm. He remembered how easy it had once been to bend women to his will with a look or a whispered promise. He had been the sun, they had been the moths. He convinced himself that this Comtesse was no different. Perhaps she was a widow seeking status, or a social climber who bought his debts merely to force an introduction. He would not beg, he would seduce. He would cast his line into the water and pull this emerald queen into his orbit, turning her financial trap into a golden cage of his own making. He imagined the moment he would corner her in a moonlit conservatory, using the same gravitational authority that had once crushed Rosalie Beaumont to disarm this new adversary. He didn't realize that the clinging vine he had once mocked had spent 6 years learning exactly how to snap an oak's branches. As he stepped into his carriage, his mind was full of the great status inversion he intended to perform. He was walking into a ballroom to hunt a woman, unaware that he was the one already caught in the teeth of a trap that had been set half a decade ago. The Duke was preparing for a conquest. The Comtesse was preparing for a funeral. The moonlit conservatory of Somerset House was a cage of glass and iron, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Adrian followed the scent of emerald silk, his heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic pulse against his ribs. He found her standing by a fountain of weeping stone, her back to him, her posture a pillar of vertical stability that seemed to mock the trembling of his own hands. "Comtesse," he began, his voice dropping into the low, honeyed register he had used to ruin 1,000 reputations. He moved closer, the predator closing in on what he believed was a moth. "You have gone to a great deal of trouble to possess my debts. Most women would simply ask for an introduction. Why play such an expensive game of shadows?" The woman did not flinch. She did not even turn. "A duke's shadow is all that remains of him, Your Grace. I simply found the light too blinding for my tastes." The voice hit Adrian like a physical blow. It was deeper than he remembered, tempered by the cold steel of the continent, but the cadence was a ghost he had tried to bury in 1819. The rising tension in the room snapped. Rosalie turned slowly, her hand rising to the gold filigree of her mask. With a clinical, unbothered motion, she removed it. The emotional shock was a silent explosion. Adrian's breath hitched, his lungs suddenly refusing the humid air. The dead-eye stoicism of the woman before him was a jagged contrast to the soft, pleading girl he had once labeled a clinging vine. This was not a moth, this was the flame. "Rosalie," he whispered, the name sounding like a confession. "The girl you knew is dead, Adrian. You killed her with a laugh behind a lace fan." She stepped toward him, her emerald gown shimmering with a high-saturation intensity that seemed to swallow the dim light. "You said I had no roots, so I grew them in the dark. I grew them through the ledgers of every bank you owed, until I reached the very foundation of your house." The power dynamic shifted so violently, it felt like the floor had tilted beneath his feet. Adrian looked into her eyes and saw no rage, only the terrifying, royal detachment of someone who had already won. The realization that his life, his name, and his very home were now under the heel of the woman he had treated like mud broke the last of his pride. His legs, once the steady pillars of a duke, gave way. Adrian fell to his knees on the damp cobblestones, his begging hands reaching out into the empty air between them. He was a horizontal ruin beneath her vertical authority. "Please," he gasped, the raw agony finally breaking through his mask of charm. "I didn't know, I would have never." "That is your tragedy, Adrian," Rosalie said, looking down at him with the same indifference one might show a crushed insect. "You only value the vine when you realize it is the only thing holding up the oak." The private coldness of the conservatory was soon replaced by the brutal golden glare of the Somerset ballroom. Adrian followed Rosalie back into the light, his steps uneven, his face a mask of raw agony barely held together by the vestiges of ducal pride. He could feel the eyes of the ton, the witness wall of aristocrats who had spent the evening whispering behind lace fans, now pivoting toward them. They smelled the blood of a fallen giant. Desperation, sharp and jagged, pushed Adrian toward a final, catastrophic mistake. He believed that if he could humiliate himself publicly, if he could offer a grand, theatrical apology, the Comtesse would be forced, by the laws of social grace, to grant him her favor. He moved to intercept her in the center of the floor, his voice cracking as it rose above the low hum of the crowd. "Rosalie, please, I must speak. I must offer my deepest penance for the follies of my youth." The name Rosalie rippled through the room like a cold draught. The music did not stop, but it seemed to thin, leaving his voice echoing against the high, gilded ceilings. Rosalie did not stop. She did not even flinch at the sound of the name he had no right to utter. As Adrian lunged forward, his begging hands outstretched in a silent plea for a scrap of her attention, he was met not with her gaze, but with a wall of scarlet and fur. The 4 King's guards, stationed as her personal protection, stepped forward with a synchronized, heavy thud of their boots. They formed a physical and psychological wall of judgment, their tall bearskin hats making them appear like impassive titans. They didn't draw their sabers, they didn't need to. They simply stood, their eyes looking through Adrian as if he were a ghost, or perhaps just a particularly persistent beggar. The vertical stability of the guards emphasized Adrian's crumpled state. He was forced to halt, his fingers inches away from the rigid wool of a soldier's tunic, while Rosalie continued her walk toward the refreshment table. She was a pillar of emerald green, moving with a dead-eye stoicism that communicated the ultimate humiliation. He was no longer worth her anger, only her security's interference. Around them, the social proof of his downfall was finalized. The very people who had once laughed at his jokes now turned their backs, their conversations resuming with a pointed, cruel intensity. Adrian stood paralyzed in the center of the room, separated from his past and his future by a line of soldiers who treated a Duke of the realm like a common nuisance. He was physically lower, socially erased, and utterly alone in a room full of people who were already practicing how to forget his name. The violins began to weep. The first notes of the night's final waltz drifted through the Somerset ballroom, a haunting, rhythmic pulse that seemed to pull the very air from the lungs of the assembly. It was the same melody that had played 6 years ago, a cruel echo of the night Rosalie Beaumont had been discarded like a wilted flower. Adrian Ravenshire moved. It was not the predatory glide of a duke, but the staggering lunge of a drowning man reaching for a jagged rock. He broke through the perimeter of the witness wall, his face a contorted map of raw agony and ugly cry desperation. He did not care for the titters of the marchionesses or the cold stares of the guards. He only saw the emerald green of the woman standing by the tall, arched windows. He reached her just as the melody swelled. The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound where even the rustle of silk seemed to die. 500 aristocrats froze, their fans lowered, their eyes wide with the voyeuristic hunger of those watching a public execution. "Rosalie," he wheezed, his voice a dry rattle. He didn't just stand before her, he leaned into her space, his body a messy, horizontal line of supplication against her rigid verticality. He extended a hand, bare, trembling, and slick with the sweat of his terror. "One dance, only one. Let the world see you take my hand, and the debts, the scandal, it all vanishes, please, for the sake of what we were." It was the big question, the ultimate gamble. In the twisted arithmetic of the ton, a dance was a debt paid. If she placed her hand in his, she was signaling a truce, a restoration of his status, and a forgiveness he had never earned. The power inversion was absolute. The man who had once claimed she wasn't worth the breath of a refusal was now using his last gasp to beg for a scrap of her laid. Rosalie did not move. Her dead-eye stoicism remained unbroken, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere far beyond his shoulder. She looked like a statue of emerald and diamond, a pillar of unshakable power that made Adrian's trembling frame look like a sapling in a gale. The silence stretched, vibrating with the tension of 500 heartbeats. Adrian's hand remained suspended in the air, a pathetic, triangular plea. He was offering her the chance to be the clinging vine again, to wrap herself around his title to save his life. The audience held its breath, waiting to see if the great status inversion would resolve in a moment of mercy or a final, devastating stroke of justice. Rosalie's fingers twitched against the silk of her skirts, the only sign that she heard the music at all. The silence in the ballroom was no longer an absence of sound, it was a physical weight. a wall of judgment that pressed against Adrian's lungs until he struggled to draw breath. He remained frozen, his begging hand extended like a broken branch, his eyes wide and stinging as he searched Rosalie's face for a flicker of the girl he had once destroyed. He looked for rage, for a biting retort, or even the sharp satisfaction of a woman finally getting her revenge. But Rosalie Beaumont gave him nothing. Her dead-eye stoicism was absolute. She did not recoil in disgust, nor did she pull her skirts away as if he were a leper. To Rosalie, the Duke of Ravenshire had ceased to be a predator, an enemy, or even a memory. He was simply a pocket of empty air. She looked through him with a cold, royal detachment that communicated the ultimate justice payoff. He was no longer worth the energy of an insult. The music swelled, a lush, mocking waltz that filled the vacuum of the room. Rosalie turned her head with a symmetrical, rigid grace, signaling the four kings' guards. They moved in a synchronized blur of scarlet, their tall bearskin hats creating a vertical barrier that physically erased Adrian from her sight. She began to walk. Her emerald silk slippers clicked against the polished floor with a terrifying precision, a rhythmic heartbeat of unshakable power. She didn't look back at the man who had collapsed onto his knees in the center of the dance floor, his raw agony now a public spectacle for the 500 aristocrats he had once led. Adrian watched the hem of her emerald gown sweep across the floor, stepping over the very spot where he had once socially killed her, leaving him in the literal and metaphorical mud of his own making. As she reached the grand doors, the social proof of his downfall was finalized. The crowd parted for her like a sea of silk, while Adrian remained a horizontal ruin, a clinging vine with no oak left to hold him up. Rosalie stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy doors closing behind her with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid. She looked at her reflection in the carriage window, no longer seeing the girl from 1819, but a woman who had finally found the truth worth fighting for. She didn't need his dance. She had already learned to lead her own life. Would you have granted him one last dance, or was his humiliation the only fair price for her pain? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of Regency revenge.